At this point, you've turned in the bid, and it becomes a waiting game to see who's going to be awarded the contract. So let's say you are the successful bidder and you're going to be awarded the contract. The owner is going to send you a notice of award. That notice of award is not the contract. It's just to let you know that they have decided to award you the contract should you get everything else done that they need done. And that was defined in the terms and conditions. So you'll need to get together your performance bond, your payment bond, your certificate of insurance, other certificates, sign agreements, and so on in order to make it the official contract. So now, once you sign the agreement and get all those things together, we move from the bidding stage into the contract stage or the award stage. Now, what we think about when we think about the contract, sometimes we just think about the form that you sign. But that form often references many other documents. Now, if you think back to the chart we used to describe all the documents in the process, that form is going to reference them. It's going to reference general and supplementary conditions. It's going to reference specifications and drawings, addenda, and then later on it's going to talk about contract mods. So all of that makes up the actual contract, even though you signed just one form. And the contract, of course, will include all the necessary information like the date of the contract, the amount, the title of the project, project numbers, all that information you should see on that agreement. We're going to look in greater detail now at the general and supplementary conditions, because these are the things that guide what you do in a project. In fact, what they're for is to define the broad aspects of the parties involved in the contract. What are the roles, the rights, duties and responsibilities of those involved in the contract? We're going to go through some of these conditions item by item. It's important for you to understand what they are. Now, from the general conditions side, those generally aren't changed. We talked about this before. They aren't changed from project to project. They're pretty set and standard. You'll see these often follow a boilerplate like the AIA documents A201. In consensus docs, you'd see document 200. So they're very boilerplate in nature with some modifications for an owner, but they stay pretty consistent from project to project. Supplementary conditions, on the other hand, they are for adding new conditions that may not have been in the general conditions that are specific to the project. They may have to change conditions in the general conditions. So if there's a general condition that needs to be changed for a project, instead of changing the general condition, they'll add a supplementary condition that says this supplementary condition changes this general condition, and then they'll specify how. So they also delete general conditions. There will be general conditions that don't apply to a project. So in the supplementary condition, it'll say delete this general condition or delete that general condition. In all cases, the supplementary conditions supersede, become more important than the general conditions because they are changing the general conditions. Now let's talk about some of the clauses that we're going to see in the general or supplementary conditions. The first one we're going to look at are change orders. Now, change orders are actually contract modifications. If you think about the chart that we looked at, it is off to the right, and it's to modify a contract. Now, the reason we need to modify a contract is something occurs. You're out in the field, you're working, and let's say there's an error on the drawings or the specifications, and that error needs to be fixed. Well, that would result in a change order because you're changing the drawings or specifications, which are part of the contract. Sometimes that change may include a cost increase, a cost decrease, or even no cost at all, just to modify the contract. So even if it doesn't include a change in price, you would still have a change order to modify the drawings or specifications. Change orders can also be used to extend the time, reduce the time. Anything about the contract that you want to change, you would do so through a change order. Now, a change order does have to be agreed upon by all parties. You can't have a contractor come up with a change order and no one else agree on it, or an owner come up with a change order that no one else agrees on. Everyone has to agree to it, has to be signed, just like a contract. Similar to a change order is change directive, and like it sounds, it is a directive. It does not modify the contract because it is a directive and it is not agreed upon by all parties. What will happen is you'll be out in the field, you'll be working. Something will come up that you need to do right away, wasn't a part of the original project, and the owner will say, just do it, we'll work it out later, get to it, because they don't want to affect the schedule. That would be a change directive. They're going to get you to do it right away. Now you have to work it out later. You're going to actually have to do a change order to make that part of the contract. So it's a little more difficult if you actually do the work and then try to work out the terms than if you try to work out the terms before you do the work. But it happens. Try to keep on schedule and so on. So change directives do happen. But again, change directives do not change the contract. Only change orders do. Change directives almost always work out to be change orders later once you agree on the terms. And if they don't work out to be change orders, sometimes they end up in disputes. Liquidated damages. So this is a big term in construction. And it often applies to projects that have a sense of urgency to get done by a certain time. One thing, if you remember nothing else about liquidated damages, you should remember that it is not a penalty. Owners don't apply liquidated damages to penalize contractors. Owners apply liquidated damages to recoup money lost due to a schedule being missed. So let's say you're building an office facility and the owner is going to collect rent just as soon as it's done and can be occupied. Every day that you delay that project, it's costing that owner money in lost rent. So they could apply liquidated damages in the amount of their loss. That's the point of liquidated damages. So it's determined up front. They're going to say how much the liquidated damages are in the clause, how much per day is usually the way that is done, and it's a realistic estimate of the actual damages to the owner. So just remember, liquidated damages is not a penalty. Now, it is an incentive, however, right? If you know as a contractor you're going to have liquidated damages at the end of a project, you'll want to make sure to get that job done as quickly as possible. You're motivated anyway. Every day you spend on a job past the day that you were scheduled to get it done, it's costing you overhead. So you're still motivated to get it done. This is just more motivation. At the opposite side of liquidated damages, you might find a clause for bonuses. It's not often used, just like penalties aren't often used. But if there's a sense of urgency to complete a project by a certain time or earlier, you might see a bonus clause. A great example of this is when the I-85 bridge collapsed in Atlanta. They were incentivized to get that bridge done as quickly as possible to get that thoroughfare completed. So they were smart. They added a very large bonus, which the contractor achieved, and earned that extra money for really compressing that schedule and getting it done quickly. So bonuses are very good at when you need to compress a schedule and get projects done early. Another clause that you should pay very close attention to is contract time. Every contract will have a duration. It'll have a start date and an end date that govern everything. The start date is typically specified in the notice to proceed as so many days following the notice to proceed. In fact, the general or supplementary conditions will specify that you'll have at least, say, 7 days from the date you receive the notice to proceed, but it could be longer. Once you get that notice to proceed, you have to make sure that you're ready to move within that period of time, those 7 days. The end date is specified by substantial completion. Substantial completion is when the owner can use the facility for its intended purpose. So you have the beginning date and the end date. So when it comes to completion, there are actually 2 types of completion that are important for every project. Substantial completion, as we said, covers when the owner can occupy the project for its intended purposes. It also means that all the systems are working, warranties start. So substantial completion is probably one of the most important completion dates in a project. In fact, the contractor can bill for everything except for punch list items at that point. And retainage starts to be released. We'll talk about retainage at another point. Final completion is when everything is done. You finished your punch list. You put together the project manual for the project, which includes all of the operating manuals for all the systems, all the warranties, everything else is complete. Now, the warranty starts at substantial completion, but you may want to include the documentation for the warranty with your final completion project book, something that you would want to organize really well for the owner that they can use to manage the building. At this point, you can submit your final billing. Retainage is an interesting thing in construction. If you think about it, you're working on a project. You complete so much of the project. You do the grading. You start doing some of the paving around the area. You're building, the foundations are going in. You reach a point where you submit a payment for all that work, and the owner says, all right, here's your payment, but I'm going to hold back 10% just in case something doesn't work out. So even though you've done the work, the owner's holding back some of that money. That's retainage. And that happens throughout the entire project life cycle up until you get substantially complete, where the owner starts to release some of that retainage back to you, if everything is done correctly. It's the idea that the owner, should a contractor walk off on a job or go bankrupt or something like that, will have an expense to hire new contractors. So that transition period is going to cost them something. And that retainage can pay for that. But if you finish the job and you finish it on time and on budget just like you were supposed to, then the retainage is yours and the owner will release that retainage back to you. Now, I've seen some situations where the retainage is reduced as the project goes along because the owner's risk is lower. But it just depends on the retainage clause within the terms and conditions. It's generally 10% until you get further along in the project. Sometimes you're going to see allowances in projects. Allowances come into projects when things aren't well defined. You'll see them a lot in residential work, especially because owners need to pick out certain things like cabinet hardware, light fixtures, and so on. So the contractor will provide allowances. They'll list cabinet hardware at a price. They'll list appliances at a price. They'll list light fixtures at a price. And that becomes the budget for the owner to actually go and select those things for the contractor to supply. If you're over that allowance, then the contract mod or change order will have to be put in place to pay the contractor what they're due over the allowance. If you go under the allowance, if you save money, then a contract mod would have to be put in place, a change order, to reduce the contract value so you pay less. Another thing that you're going to want to look at are pass-through clauses. Pass-through clauses are clauses that the owner has with you in the general or supplementary conditions that they want you then to pass down to the agreements between you and your subcontractors. They want to make sure everybody has the same clauses included in their contract. One of the other things that you'll do in a pass-through clause is you'll make sure that the subcontractors know that they'll get paid when you get paid. Now you think about that for a moment. Let's say you have a subcontractor out on a job, electrical subcontractor, they complete the work, right? They wire a building, and then they submit to you an invoice. Okay, you take that invoice, you take other invoices from other subs, supplies, and so on, and you put together an invoice for an owner. So you turn that over to the owner. Well, already time has passed. By the time the owner gets your invoice. So the owner gets your invoice, they look it over, they look at the work, make sure you did the work, and eventually they get around to paying you. Once you get paid, you pay the subcontractor. So now think about how much time it took from the time the subcontractor finished the work, submitted the invoice, you prepared another invoice, submitted to the owner got around to paying you, and you paid the subcontractor. So who do you think is really financing this job? It's the subcontractor. They had to pay for everything. They had to pay their labor to do the work. And they're not receiving payment until it goes through those couple of steps to finally get back to them. There is a clause in the general or the supplementary conditions that's going to protect an owner against a lawsuit caused by something that may occur on the project. That clause is called indemnification. And you're going to indemnify or protect the owner against a lawsuit for some action that may occur that results in a lawsuit. You could be driving a truck onto the site, and you can actually hit another car, not related to the project, and let's say that person's sued. Well, they're not going to just sue you as a contractor. That's not the way lawsuits work. Lawsuits name everybody. So they're going to sue the contractor, they're going to sue the owner, and they may sue some subcontractors as well. Your indemnification clause says that you're going to protect the owner in case of that lawsuit. Now you got to read these carefully. I actually had a situation one time that said we're going to indemnify the owner for acts of their people. So let's say they had an inspector show up to the job site one day and the inspector hit another car and then the owner got sued. They wanted us to cover that liability as well. Of course, they didn't agree to it and they had to strike it from the contract before we would sign. But that's why you got to read this kind of clause very carefully, because you got to think about when you indemnify something, you are paying all the costs associated with attorneys and fines and so on. Let's say you're working on a project and they're still involved and they're doing some welding. And the sparks from that welding fly off and set a fire and burn down the entire project. Or take another scenario. You're working on a project and a tornado hits and destroys the project. Well, who pays for that project? I mean, you own the project until you turn it over to the owner. So in a sense, you're paying for the project and for the loss. Well, your general conditions or your supplementary conditions are going to require that you have a thing called builder's risk. Builder's risk covers you for the risk of those things that might occur while you're building the project. So if you do something and it burns down the building that you're working on, or in the middle of construction or tornado hits, builder's risk will cover the cost of that loss. When you're working on a project, not everything goes right every time. Sometimes your subs don't show up on time. Sometimes the material isn't the quality that you expected. Lots of things happen. You try to correct them as quickly as possible. It doesn't all go perfect. But when things go wrong often, then you could be in default of your contract. And there's a clause that's about notice to cure a default. And it's going to tell you what you need to do when you get a notice like that. If you get a notice to cure default, you're not doing too well. You didn't have enough people on a job, you're falling behind schedule, you don't have the right equipment on the job, something's not right. And this is all identified by the construction administrator, the architect, or the owner. And they're going to tell you, you need to fix these things. Worse yet, let's say you're just disregarding the law. So once you get that notice to cure default, if you don't cure that default in the terms set by the contract, usually a certain number of days, you will be held in breach. And it could mean the termination of your contract. So let's say you're out working on a project and you find a discrepancy in the contract documents. For example, let's say the specifications tell you that certain things should be a certain way, and the drawings actually tell you that they should be a different way. Well, that conflict could be handled if the contract documents include an order of precedence clause. An order of precedence clause will rank order the documents in precedent order. So the ones at the top will take precedence over the ones at the bottom. In such a ranking, if they rank specifications before drawings, that you know that if there was conflict, the specifications would rule. Now, in that situation, you would probably do a request for information, just to be sure. But lacking that, you would actually just go with the one that is the highest precedent. They do this because it's hard to get everything perfect. You know, documents are being prepared by different people at different times, and it's hard to get everything perfect. So when they put an order of precedence clause in there, they're saying, hey, lacking perfection, this clause or this document takes precedence over this one. So construction's not perfect, and no one expects it to be. Things change out in the field, you have weather problems, all sorts of things change, which makes it less than perfect. But every once in a while, something comes up where they can't work it out in the field. This is a dispute. And when you have a dispute, the best way to resolve the dispute is at the lowest level possible. If the dispute is two subcontractors, maybe the plumbing subcontractor cut some electrical wire and something has to be done about it, the best two parties to work out that dispute are those subcontractors at that lowest level. If need be, if they can't work it out, well, they could take it up to the superintendent, and that superintendent can help them work it out. The idea is resolve it. Resolve it at the lowest level possible and keep things moving. If you move up even further, say to the project manager, the closer you are getting to a lawsuit. And that is the last thing you want on a project. So when it comes to disputes, make sure you keep them at the lowest level. Now, oftentimes in contracts, you should see a dispute resolution clause to work through a process so that you can avoid lawsuits.